You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
Welcome back. We're here to talk about estrogen and muscle. I think a hot topic and one that hopefully you guys will all appreciate. A little diversion. We're not going to talk a lot specifically about yoga, but I think you guys will get the gist of some of the implications and hopefully get to experiment in your own way as we continue to learn more about this fascinating field of female health and hormones. And I do just want to start by mentioning too that we just recently launched our in-person training, which is going to be traditional Chinese medicine along with our female health training in Tulum in March in 2025. So check it out if you're interested. If you are interested in this topic, you will love our female health training, and that will go into a lot of the applications to yoga too. So there you have it. Let's hop right in and talk about specifically, I think, some of the background on, I know we've talked a lot about estrogen in relationship to connective tissue and fascia, which has some research that we can look at now. But now we're going to shift and look specifically at estrogen and muscle, which also has some interesting implications as well. So
yeah,
take it away.
I felt it was only fair because we've been talking about fascia on here a lot, and we've talked about fascia specifically, ligaments, anterior cruciate ligament, and estrogen or female hormones, because there has been a lot of research on that. It's probably like the structure or injury related, the injury that has been researched best when it comes to sex hormones and sex differences. And it just felt fair to also include the effects on estrogen and muscle, because we'll see that there's a lot of beneficial effects to be explored and elaborated. So yeah, it felt fair to give estrogen and its effect on muscle an episode as well.
And I think it's helpful to like zoom in. We do this in all of our trainings too. You know, obviously when we zoom into the fascia or the shoulder or the nervous system, we leave out all these other systems. But we know estrogen as well has impacts on the cardiovascular system, the bones, and so many other things. But for this episode, really looking specifically at the muscles so we can dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, let's do.
I love it. All right. Well, let's talk about, how it's being studied, because I think the background of that is really interesting, and you can give us a nice perspective on that. And I think looking at how the research is done is really important to really understand what it means to us better.
I think that's really interesting to note to start with, because we have different approaches on how to study the effects of sex hormone on the system. And it really matters, I think, to look at some of the depths or detail in the studies, how it's being researched, because that then results in how well we can transfer that to us humans or to real life scenarios. So generally speaking, how sex hormones are being studied, or their effects are being studied, are three types of studies, we could say. One is just biology, so basic biology, molecular biology. Then we have animal models, and then we have studies in humans. So when we look at molecular biology, think cell cultures, think we're looking at certain types of cells and how they react to high or low levels of estrogen. We'll probably chat about satellite cells later on, which are important to muscle. So that could be studied in cell cultures. So that's like one major group of studies being done, more in the basic research realm with microbiology approaches and techniques. Then estrogen is a lot being studied in animal models, mainly in rodents, so mice or rats. And there's different avenues to that. So sometimes what's being used is knockout mice, meaning certain genes in them are missing. For instance, genes for estrogen receptors. So those animals then do not express estrogen receptors. And that is perfect for studying like the dynamics and the activity of estrogen in the body. That's one type of animal model that's being used. And then another is a model where we kind of mimic estrogen deficiency, similar to menopause or postmenopause. In those animals, then the ovaries are removed. That then pretty much resembles the state in postmenopause, where we don't produce that much estrogen anymore. And then you could take a couple of animals which receive hormone treatment with estrogen, and the other animals won't. And then you have a good comparison how estrogen impacts the body there. So animal models, and we could discuss about what we think about animal models, but that's a different conversation, but it's a big one, how this is being studied. And then the last one is studies on humans, which would be most easily or best transferable to humans, of course. And there we have different ways. So one is actually, we know a lot of stuff on estrogen from research on postmenopausal women. So same thing like we just discussed. In postmenopause, estrogen levels are low. So it's the state of estrogen deficiency. And then in those women, you could treat with hormones, with estrogen and or progesterone, for instance, and then see how that affects the body compared to women who do not receive that treatment. And in women of reproductive age, because that's a whole different story, then again, what's being done is comparing women who take oral contraceptives, so the pill, because that's a down-regulated hormonal milieu, and compare them to women who are regularly menstruating. Or we could compare women in different phases or states of their menstrual cycle, and then see what that does. So different avenues, different approaches, and you will be able to transfer that to the greater population or to female people as a whole in different ways, obviously.
Yeah, and I think all obviously, as you well know, I mean, all are pretty limited, especially when we talk about petri dishes and cell cultures. Like we're completely taking it out of the system and looking at it in isolation with a lot of things missing, and in animal models too. I mean, obviously we're talking about what does this look like in an animal, or maybe oftentimes a rat or mouse versus us. You can tell there's a lot of differences there as well. And even in human models, there's a lot of things to kind of weigh into perspective. But what we do get a good view of is this kind of extreme change, this very clear change that happens in menopause, where the body has less estradiol exposure. And so, yeah, it gives us a really good view to see what's happening. And I think we've learned so much in the past decade that we can start to apply to look at now the impact of estrogen on the musculoskeletal system, and specifically the muscles themselves. So good
and maybe
information.
Because definitely, and that's maybe another side note, if you're totally into hormones and into estrogen, because you've already mentioned estradiol, it's also important to mention that there are different types of estrogen that are predominant in different phases of a woman's life. So during reproductive years, that's estradiol, and then as we age in menopause, that's estrone mainly. And the hormones that are being administered with hormone therapy are then typically synthetic hormones or derived from animals again. So that's another layer of this. And when you want to transfer that to a young woman in her reproductive years, we really have to keep in mind that there's different aspects and different types of estrogen that are being studied as well.
Yeah. And, HRT is a whole longer conversation that we're not going to get into, but luckily there are a lot of people talking about it right now for us. But back to estrogen and muscle, and really talking about the impacts of estrogen on muscle specifically.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive right in. So one major aspect of estrogen, how it impacts muscle, is its effect on muscle mass. So just the amount of muscle. And estrogen, it has an anabolic effect on muscle. So meaning it promotes the biosynthesis of protein in muscle. So it just helps muscle grow. And that could then be positively associated or modulate the effects of strength training, for example, so hypertrophy effects, muscle growth in response to training. So it could be hypothesized that when estrogen in the body is high, the muscle mass is also being maintained or even increases. And that's one that we also know very well from postmenopausal women, or perimenopausal women also, because that time of a woman's life is when the muscle mass decreases in an accelerated manner. So we lose muscle mass throughout life, but during that phase of a woman's life when estrogen really drops and we reach that state of estrogen, or more specifically estradiol deficiency, that's when muscle mass really goes down more quickly. And then if you do take hormonal replacement therapy or supplementation therapy, that can be beneficial, especially if you combine it with exercise. So it's one of those examples where we know a lot of that from the research in postmenopausal women.
Yeah, and really important, of course, to keep stimulating the muscle, because even if you are premenopausal or taking hormones and not exercising, of course, muscle mass is going to decline if we don't stimulate the tissues. So exercise
Definitely.
is a key link there.
That definitely takes us a little bit into application, even though that's not a focus of today. So you still have to move, ideally, right? That's when we see the best effects. So taking exercise, taking strength training with that would be the ideal approach. So the estrogen per se, of course, has a beneficial effect, but our lifestyle factors do as well.
And, we talk about this a bunch in the female health training, but this idea of kind of estrogen and progesterone being like yin and yang, very different, very opposing substances. We know that progesterone obviously has catabolic effects, so really different effects than estrogen. And so when we think about it in that way, I think we're thinking about the interchange of these hormones and how they work with each other, how they stimulate the body in different ways, but also kind of working together to create balance. And obviously that changes quite a bit as our hormones change too.
Yeah, I really love that aspect of the yin and yang of TCM and how that connects to female health in general and to those hormones. I think it just displays so beautifully how those two go together. So yeah, so progesterone more has catabolic effects, and it also has different or opposing effects regarding to other factors in the muscle. So for instance, neuromuscular control. I find that also really amazing and exciting. So regarding neuromuscular activation, we see again opposing effects of estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen has excitatory effects, so it kind of stimulates neurons and how they communicate and just generally how they work. So that could be translated into positive relationship with force generation when it comes to strength. So again, could be hypothesized that when estrogen's high, the force generation, how much strength you produce, how much force you generate, would also be high or more facilitated. And then progesterone has an inhibitory effect. So just opposing to that, again, kind of highlighting that yin and yang of those two hormones there when it comes to neuromuscular control, which I think is generally, when talking about muscle, a whole own conversation, which is just fascinating.
I think it's really interesting too, because we tend to think of estrogen as like, I feel like a lot of people associate it with like moodiness and weeping and like all of these, fragility in many ways, or sensitivity. And, I think it's important to recognize that all of these, like the yin and the yang, like there's pros and cons to both. And really it is that balance that brings it. And even something like estrogen, which can be very anabolic, like testosterone, muscle enhancing, muscle building, has its own other facets to it. Hormones can affect us in so many different ways, and so many more than even what we're talking about on here, obviously. So
yeah, definitely. I think that interplay, we in many instances, or related to many factors we don't even fully understand yet, or the details of all of that. But it's just fascinating how those hormones work together and their intricate relationship with each other and with all those bodily systems. I think that's why hormones, and specifically reproductive or sex hormones, are really being discussed a lot these days because they are just fascinating and complex, and that's really intriguing, I think. At least,
and so hard to pinpoint too, because if you're like testing blood levels, it's very controversial to test hormones because there's not a set range, and it varies at every point in your cycle, and even from one cycle to the next. So it's so tricky to really get a really clear map of hormones, and everyone has different opinions on how to do that, or if you can do that well. But our symptoms also give us an interesting input to that, and I think yoga for me gives us a way to really sense and feel into that in a way that's significant. And many practitioners now, I would say probably in my experience as a healthcare provider, most practitioners who work in female health don't test for hormones, but really go on symptoms. Again, everyone has their own opinion on that. But I think my point is that our experience in our bodies, moving or otherwise, gives us a really good picture into our hormones. And obviously working with a specialist and will help you decode what that means. Because if you try and decode it on your own, you might just get lost in the maze. But having someone help you can be good. But there's a lot of ways that it can manifest. And so far we've talked about specifically muscle mass, effects of estrogen on muscle mass, and then neuromuscular activation. But there's a couple others too that are important and interesting.
Yes, and before we move right into the next one, just wanted to add one more thought or one more finding from the majority of the research, and also the research works that kind of synthesize a lot of the studies out there. So-called systematic reviews or meta-analyses, if you're into the methodology bits. They all, or a lot of them actually, conclude that individuality in working with women when they want to focus on their hormones is just so important, because we do not even fully understand yet how those hormonal fluctuations, how much of that impact on women and how they respond to it, how much that is due to their individuality. It is for sure a huge factor to be explored, and to work that systematically or with someone is really a big takeaway from the research as well. So wanted to add that. And actually
and as a clinician, as someone who's seen thousands of females over the past 20 years, I would say absolutely. It really is so different from person to person, whether you're talking about before menopause or perimenopause, or menopause itself as well, all of those different phases of our female lifespan or post-menopause. I think it really is so individual, and why it's so helpful to work with someone who can help you decode that. But muscle function.
Yes. And actually, but your segue into that with like the measurements and stuff, that's the perfect segue into the next one, into muscle function, because you already or also mentioned testosterone. And for example, we're mainly talking about estrogen today, but for example, testosterone also in us women has an impact on muscle function, strength, in that case specifically. So muscle function, strength is also impacted by estrogen and by testosterone. And testosterone is thought to peak at ovulation, in smaller degrees, but is thought to peak around ovulation. But how we measure that's kind of like, we know that from saliva, so from salivary testing and from serum levels, but the bioavailable testosterone, for example, we don't know yet. So again, just underlining what you said, that the hormone levels we're talking about, it's also a matter of how we test that, what kind of levels we test. So testosterone is one, and how we measure that is a bigger story. And estrogen, which takes the main stage today, also is thought to have an impact on muscle function, on strength, on force generation, as we said. And there's a couple of aspects to this, but I want to highlight one potential mechanism that has been analyzed or that has been proposed, which is the effect of estrogen on a molecular level. So how it affects myosin, which is one of the contractile proteins in the muscle, which binds to actin, myosin and actin, you may remember from biology, or you may just know. And when estrogen is high, the way how myosin binds to actin is different than when estrogen is low, so in estrogen deficiency state. And that's one of the things that we know from animal studies. So when estrogen is low in estrogen deficient rodents, that quality of the bind between myosin and actin is lower. So we don't have that intense strong binding myosin as much. So that deficiency of estrogen detrimentally impacts myosin. And then on the other hand, when you give those animals estrogen, then that binding quality of the myosin changes to the better, to a more intense or higher degree binding. And fourth generation changes with that as well. So that can also be seen in fourth generation as a functional parameter as well. So long story short, when you have more estrogen in the system in those animals, the contracture, the force generation, the strength is higher than in the animals that have estrogen deficiency. So just how your muscle contracts on a contractile protein level is also impacted by estrogen.
And, I think these first three are interesting, whether we're talking about muscle mass or neuromuscular activation or muscle strength and force production. I think for most females listening to this, as we get deeper into our 40s and maybe even early in our 40s for some, we feel this, we sense it. Again, there is a felt sense to this, and it doesn't mean that it's not something we can work with, but we have to be skillful. We have to be really conscious and deliberate and make sure that we're on top of it. And, but I do think most people, most of the females I've talked to and worked with have sensed this in their bodies over time. And for some that might catch up to them very quickly. For some that might happen very slowly over a whole decade. But I think most females can agree with the changes that happen during this decade of our lives.
Yeah. And I think that's also why like more intense resistance or strength training has recently gotten a lot more attention and has really gotten a good rep recently, are exactly those points, like the effects or changes that we see with deferring or changing estrogen levels on muscle mass, the neuromuscular control aspect of it, and also just the force production contractile element effects of it. All of those would really be relevant to high intensity training or resistance training, and how that speaks to the muscle if we go through or experience those changes in estrogen levels.
And, I think of it less as as a sentencing, right? Like it can feel really negative, but for me as a female in my 40s, I feel it really liberating and empowering to know that these are the things that are happening, and to know that I can have a really big impact if I'm very deliberate and persistent and, stay on course, that I can really have an impact here. I mean, we see this in athletes too, and people who, have train. Obviously, the training has to maybe change and be a little bit different or more deliberate around this time. And obviously the gains are going to be different, but it is something we can work with. And I think for most people listening to this podcast, I think a lot of the people listening in yoga medicine, our goal, is to feel our best, and knowing these things can be a really helpful way to get there and navigate that.
And I think
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, and another goal of ours, I think, is just to help you understand and to create that knowledge to understand what's behind all of it, so you can experiment and explore in your own body and see what that feels like in your body, and how that translates into your practice, into your life. Because if you can use that as a variable and see what it does in your own body. So I think it's really important and interesting to understand those backgrounds on hormones and many other things as well, of course.
We have been talking a lot about females, but we do know that men do experience hormonal changes as they get older as well. It's just, unfortunately, I mean, I think fortunately, unfortunately, I think females, our cycle gets a lot of attention and we start to understand it, but men do go through hormonal changes as well. Not like menopause, not quite as distinct and clear, but there is a hormone decline with men as they get older as well that is a lot more vague and slow. But there are changes happening as well, just to include the men.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
So we have one more. So there is one more way. We've already talked about muscle mass, muscle strength, neuromuscular activation, but another one that's really important when we're talking about muscle to talk about.
Yeah, that's also the regeneration and recovery side of things. And regarding to muscle, there's one specific cell we already mentioned that really has a big role in that, which are satellite cells. So that's basically adult muscle stem cells that help to repair and recover and rebuild muscle after exercise or after injury or any type of stress on the muscle. So they're really essential in that recovery process. And we know that satellite cells also have receptors for estrogen, meaning they respond to different levels of estrogen. And we also know that their function changes in women that go through menopause. So, again, using kind of that human model going from premenopause to postmenopause, what changes to the satellite cells. And function and number is impacted by that decline of estrogen during that phase. So there are a couple of studies that show that when women go through perimenopause and eventually to postmenopause, that the number of satellite cells is simply shrinking. So our satellite cells get less, and that can, of course, then impact our recovery and regeneration to exercise, but also just to life. And that is one big point there. I mentioned that there's a couple of studies on humans, but in fact, most studies on satellite cells are either being done in petri dishes, so in cell cultures, or in animal models. So I've picked one example from the few human studies we have there. But regarding muscle recovery and strength, that's actually more from the animal model side of things, but important to note nevertheless, I think. So that's one big portion of the research on muscle regeneration and recovery and estrogen. And then also more generally, it's known that estrogen has antioxidant capacities and is also protecting the membrane of cells, so also of muscle cells. And it's thought that antioxidant and membrane stabilizing effect or characteristic of estrogen can help with protecting from muscle damage as response to exercise, and also beneficially impact inflammatory processes. So it's also known that when estrogen is high, women experience a bit less of that exercise-induced muscle damage. And when, I guess, estrogen is lower, that then is a lot more or higher. And those inflammatory processes have been studied quite much as well. So inflammation and regeneration, recovery, that all is also impacted by estrogen.
Yeah, again, I think one that most females experience as well, and somewhere through their 40s, maybe in their 50s, maybe in their 30s even, is that recovery does change. And, obviously it can be influenced by a lot of other things: hydration, nutrition, rest, restore. I mean, like the restorative practice, we have so many great ways to support recovery on our Yoga Medicine online practice site. It's such an important thing to us. But I do think if you take the same person doing the same routine over their lifespan, if we were to not change that, which is rare, you would see differences. And I think most females experience this. Again, I don't think it's like a doom and gloom thing, but it does remind us, especially for those of you listening and being motivated now to stimulate your muscle cells, your muscle tissue, that especially if you're starting in your 40s or beyond, like, we need to start slowly. It needs to be slowly progressive. Any stimulus to the tissues that's new will be helpful, and progressing that slowly over time so that our bodies can respond and our muscles can respond, as well as our connective tissues. We can stimulate strength and mass and neuromuscular activation, and as well as support recovery. And again, off the topic of this conversation, but we have a ton of tools on our Yoga Medicine online, yogamedicine.com site, to support recovery. And it's something that is really important. I think that is a place that yoga can really efficiently and effectively fill in. And I just got back from Berlin and teaching the yoga for athletes. You were there as well, Katja. And there are a lot of ways that yoga can support work with athletes and athletic endeavors, and I use them myself as well as with professional to recreational athletes. But I think recovery is one of the big ones and probably the one that gets used the most, because the faster we can recover, the better we can get back to our training. And so there's a lot of great resources that we're not going to talk about in yoga that can help assist recovery, but it is changing. And again, it's not a doom and gloom, but it's a recognizing it, maybe spending a little bit more time in recovery practices, also being really slowly progressive in your strength training endeavors, and knowing that your body's going to be a little different. And that's great. Like if we're lucky enough to live long enough to experience all of the changes of the different lifespan, I think it's also part of our yoga endeavors to embrace that evolution and change instead of fighting it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And I really want to reiterate that this is not a doom and gloom scenario like you're mentioning. I think when we talk about those female hormones, we can easily end up with a mindset where it's like, ooh, I want all the estrogen, and life before my 40s or 50s was so much better than after, or a certain time within menstrual cycle is better, or not taking the pill is a necessity, or like any of these that kind of come with an absolute statement about a hormonal state. And I just want to reiterate that also from a research end, we really see that the individuality of it is a big part, and just experiencing how you go through fluctuations of your sex hormones, be it on a monthly basis or throughout your lifespan, is just such a big part of it. And noticing how your body adapts, how your body responds, and tuning in and then really taking action to respond to that to the degree that you can. An elite athlete might not be able to go with every little hint of change in body perception every day, because they are on a schedule also, and you have to go to work if you're not an elite athlete. So there's a whole bunch of implications, but getting to know your fluctuations, how you respond to them, how your recovery, how your restoration, how your training feels, or generally just life. I think that's just such an important starting point, or maybe even the most important thing about the whole thing, instead of coming up with recipes that are absolute or make us feel better or worse because we're in a certain phase of our lives. Yeah, just want to reiterate that. You've mentioned it a couple of times today, but I think it's just so important to mention again and again and again.
I think it's so different for each person. Like you said, some people, it's pretty, I think we talked about this on one of our previous episodes, but like some people will actually strangely feel better during their period. I remember a professional Ironman athlete who that was the only time she would get her period was on a race. Like, I mean, obviously there's more to discuss there, but most women feel better when they have exposure to these hormones, both testosterone and estrogen, and I mean, even progesterone a little later on. But in that mid-cycle phase, when we have higher hormone levels around ovulation, I think that's the majority of people. However, everyone is really different. And what I love about Chinese medicine too is when it talks about menopause, where the hormones become more level and stable, there is an implication of wisdom in the steadiness now that happens with the hormones. Obviously, they're lower, but they are more consistent, and it's like tapping into this inherent wisdom that which used to be really a part of our culture, this wisdom with aging and looking to our elders and really appreciating this kind of later phases of life. And I think it's important to remember that as well, those of you who are in your 40s or 50s or beyond, that there is benefit and positivity around that later stage too. We're talking about just the impacts of estrogen, of course. But again, I think what's really cool about what we're talking about today is the empowerment that comes from it. Knowing that you have something that you can work with and to recognize it in your own body. So the effects of estrogen on muscles, on muscle mass, strength, neuromuscular activation, but also on regeneration and recovery. So important and just helpful to keep in mind. So let's talk a little bit about the implications? Well, we've kind of already talked on these a little bit, but like, the takeaways, what does this mean to us?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a big conversation, and we've done other podcast episodes on this. So just really more of a hint towards that, maybe. This could mean a lot of things when you work out, when you exercise regularly. So let's say you're in your reproductive years, potentially you may want to change how you train throughout the cycle. The research is not consistent on this, or there are still question marks on how specifically the menstrual cycle and the different hormone profiles that go with it impact the outcomes of training. Also, we have really few studies that really look at a longer time span. So following women over a couple of months of training and seeing how they adapt, there's not enough studies on that yet. So that again would point to looking at your individual reaction to your hormonal fluctuations, and then maybe adjust some of your training if you can. So that would be one implication, just really responding to those fluctuations of estrogen and progesterone throughout your cycle, and maybe making adjustments to your training, but also maybe to your everyday life. And the other would be that in that transition from pre-menopause through perimenopause and then towards post-menopause, that you may need different things, like you've hinted at a couple of times already. So you may want to or have to adjust your training and your lifestyle a bit and see if that lower of hormones, if they just require you to change things. And yeah, there's a wisdom in that and a landing in that as well. I have to say, because I'm kind of representing the research end a bit more typically in our conversations, that the research that has been evolving is great. And there has been a lot of new research over the last 1 or 2 decades on female sex hormones and sports science in general. But there's still a lot that we don't know. I personally think the fact that the studies are still kind of heterogeneous, so they kind of contradict each other in some cases, that's partly because there are methodological issues in the studies. So they're very different from each other. Some look at, or many look at just small cohorts, just a couple of women. Then we have studies on elite athletes and sedentary women and people who have trained before and some who haven't at all. And we're trying to get like one clear picture for all of those different cohorts, which is, as you can imagine, really hard. The measures we take are very inconsistent and different across studies. So I think it's great that we have a lot more research, but also we still have a way to go, which is not surprising. We have decades of research on which only included men, and we have to catch up. And that takes some time to get that degree of consistency and broadness in the research to really display all that. So that's also kind of like my shout out to all the research nerds out there. Don't get frustrated when you look into the research and things are contradicting each other at this point in time. When you look at female health research, some of it might just be because the methods are very different from study to study. And also then those syntheses of research, the reviews of research, also take that into consideration or conclude exactly that. So yeah, don't be afraid to dig a little deeper and to understand what's being looked at and to look into that, because there's still lots we don't know yet. As always, this is still rapidly evolving.
Yeah, I love that. I think you can copy and paste that to all of our research roundup episodes too, because research is ongoing and is always being updated. And so we have to stay open to that. But I think for me, one of the big takeaways from this episode is that knowledge is power and it allows us to adapt. And I think as yogis, it's our job to adapt and embrace the different phases of life as a way to adapt and support ourselves. And the more knowledge we collect, the more we can do that. And at Yoga Medicine, we're such big believers in this fusion of Eastern and Western concepts of being able to really appreciate the tradition and a lot of the experience that these practices have given us over time, but also take with it the science and the research that is now developing. And this really applies to female hormones, especially as well, so that we can take both of these lenses into our practice, especially if you're a therapeutic yoga teacher especially kind of being able to take both of these lenses in to better support the individual in front of us. And, who knows, at some point, obviously we're going to have more research on this, but I also think the individuality is such a big part of this, from one female to another, from one decade of our life to another. Of course, there's a lot of differences there. And so I always say, like, for me, yoga is the foundation of all of our healthcare because it gives us good input into what's actually happening, what's actually feeling. Of course, we can measure things on labs, but that's one moment in time. What we get to do in our experience is feel into, of course, that subjective experience, but to be able to really feel into the reality of a life lived and really sense, what's helpful to us. And to me, that's a big part of the empowerment as well. So hopefully this and other previous episodes that we've done, I know episode 97 was another one that we talked about hormones, but hopefully this and our previous podcast can give you some knowledge and empower you so that you can adapt and use this in a way that's helpful for you. So, and just one more reminder too, if you are interested in this topic and want to dig deeper, we do have a lot of resources online. We have our online female health teacher training, as well as we also have it in person along with our traditional Chinese medicine training. So if you're interested in using this more therapeutically in a yoga context, check it out. We've got the in-person one coming up in Tulum in March 2025, and always more resources here on the podcast. I think we covered it all. Anything last you have to add?
No, I'm good. Thanks for summing it up nicely.
So thank you, Katja. Thanks for bringing all the research to us. Lots of great applications and things that you might be able to use on your own. And we look forward to next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.